Jake had always loved making funny videos. He and his friends had a habit of doing harmless pranks, posting them online, and getting laughs from their followers. During their trip to London, they visited Buckingham Palace, eager to see the famous royal guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. Jake had watched many videos of these guards standing still, no matter what people did around them. To him, they seemed like statues, completely unshakable. As Jake and his friends stood near the palace gates, they noticed a group of royal guards marching in formation. The guards moved with perfect discipline, their boots clicking against the ground in unison. Jake's friend, Mark, nudged him and whispered, "I dare you to mess with one of them." Jake smirked. "Like what?" he asked. "Try to take his weapon," Mark said, laughing. "Just for a second. See if he even reacts." The rest of the group chuckled, encouraging Jake. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the guards. They were known for never showing emotions, never reacting to anything around them. It seemed like the perfect harmless prank, something quick, something funny, and something that would get a lot of views online. Feeling the excitement rush through him, Jake turned on his phone's camera, ready to record. He walked toward one of the guards, who stood tall and motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The crowd of tourists nearby had their attention elsewhere, taking pictures and admiring the palace. Jake thought it was now or never. With a grin on his face, he took a step closer and quickly reached out to grab the end of the guard's rifle. He only meant to hold it for a brief moment, just enough to make a funny clip. But the second his fingers touched the weapon, everything changed. Before Jake could even process what was happening, the guard moved faster than he had expected. With a sudden and powerful motion, the guard yanked his weapon back, shoving Jake backward with his other hand. His deep voice boomed through the air as he commanded, "Step it back." The force of the push caught Jake off guard, making him stumble. The loud command sent a shockwave through the crowd, and people turned their heads to see what had happened. Some gasped, others raised their phones to record. The laughter that had been in the air just moments ago disappeared. Jake's heart pounded. He had thought the guards were just there for show, that they wouldn't react. But now, standing face to face with the soldier, he realized how serious the situation was. The guard's grip on his weapon was firm, his expression unchanging, his posture strong and ready. Jake took a step back, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. His friends, who had been laughing earlier, were now silent, their faces pale. The energy of the moment had shifted completely. What started as a lighthearted joke had suddenly turned into something much more intense. Jake's heart was still pounding as he took a step back. The royal guard, who had just pushed him away, remained in his position, standing tall and strong. His face showed no emotion, but his powerful reaction had made it clear this was not a joke. The crowd around them was now focused entirely on Jake. Some people had their phones out, recording the scene. Others whispered among themselves, shocked at what they had just witnessed. Jake felt his cheeks grow hot. He had never been in a situation like this before. It was supposed to be a harmless prank, just for fun. But now, it was turning into something serious. Mark and the others, who had been laughing moments ago, were no longer smiling. Instead, they looked nervous. "Dude, let's just go," Mark muttered under his breath. "This is bad." Jake swallowed hard. He knew they were right. But before he could turn around and walk away, something else happened. Another guard, standing nearby, stepped forward slightly, gripping his weapon firmly. His eyes locked onto Jake, as if warning him not to try anything else. Then, from a short distance away, 2 police officers started walking toward them. Jake felt his stomach twist. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid. He hadn't meant any harm, but now, it looked like he had done something really wrong. The officers moved quickly, their expressions serious. One of them, a tall man with a firm voice, spoke first. "Step aside, sir," he said, motioning for Jake to move away from the guard. Jake nodded quickly and took another step back. His hands were sweating, and he suddenly wished he had never listened to Mark's dare. The officer looked him up and down before asking, "Do you realize what you just did?" I was just messing around," Jake stammered. "It was just a joke." The officer didn't seem amused. "This is not a place for jokes," he said firmly. "You attempted to touch a Royal Guard's weapon. That is a serious offense." Jake's stomach dropped. He had only touched it for a second. Surely that wasn't a crime. But looking at the officer's stern face, he knew this wasn't something he could just laugh off. People in the crowd were still watching. Some were whispering, others shaking their heads. Jake suddenly felt incredibly foolish. He had come to London for an unforgettable trip, but now he was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. The second officer stepped forward. "We need to have a word with you," he said. "Come with us." Jake's breath caught in his throat. His friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do, but there was nothing they could do. The officers had made their decision. As Jake started walking with them, he felt the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. This wasn't just a silly prank anymore. This was real, and it was only getting worse. Jake walked with the officers, feeling his feet get heavier with each step. The air around him seemed to thicken, and every passing moment felt more uncomfortable than the last. His friends followed behind, their faces a mixture of worry and disbelief. They had never imagined that a simple prank would lead to something like this. The officers led him to a small area behind a nearby building, away from the curious eyes of the crowd. There, they stopped, and Jake was asked to stand against a wall. The tall officer, who had spoken to him earlier, looked at him sternly. "Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" he asked again. Jake swallowed, his throat dry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he replied, his voice shaky. He was starting to regret his decision more with every passing second. What had seemed like a funny idea moments ago now felt like the worst choice he could have made. The officers exchanged a glance before the second one spoke. "You could have caused a major security breach. That rifle is not just a prop. It's part of the security measures here. Touching it, especially in such a way, is a potential threat." Jake didn't know what to say. He had no idea that messing with the guards could be seen as such a big deal. He thought they were just part of the tourist attraction, their job being to stand still and look impressive for photos. But now, it seemed like he had underestimated everything. "Where are you from?" the first officer asked, his tone softening just a bit. "I'm from the U.S., Jake answered quickly, his heart still racing. The officer nodded. "Well, it's important that you understand the gravity of what you've done, especially since you're not from here. The security measures in place are for everyone's safety, including yours." Jake nodded, trying to make sense of the situation. He felt like he was in over his head. He had heard stories of tourists getting into trouble while traveling, but he never thought he would be one of those stories. "Please, I didn't mean any harm," Jake pleaded. "I just thought it would be funny. I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone or cause any issues." The second officer gave him a look that said they'd heard this kind of apology before. "I understand you didn't intend to do anything wrong, but your actions could have led to something much worse. You don't know how the guards or other security personnel might have reacted. It's a dangerous game you're playing." Jake felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. The fun prank he thought he was pulling had turned into something serious, and he had no idea how it had escalated so quickly. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this mess. As the officers continued to question him, Jake realized he couldn't take back what he had done. All he could do now was hope that the situation didn't spiral any further. But deep down, he knew that the consequences of his actions were far from over. Jake stood in silence as the two officers continued to question him. His mind felt foggy, like everything had become a blur in just a matter of minutes. He could still hear the voice of the Royal Guard echoing in his head. "Step back." He had never imagined that a harmless prank would spiral into this kind of mess. The officers didn't seem to show much sympathy. One of them continued to ask questions, his voice firm and steady. "Who encouraged you to do this?" he asked. Jake looked over at his friends, who were standing a little farther back, looking both concerned and embarrassed. He could feel their eyes on him, and he knew they were thinking the same thing. "Why did you do this?" It was just me," Jake said, feeling ashamed. "My friends didn't think it would be a big deal." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Even if your friends didn't directly tell you to grab the weapon, they were still part of the situation. They saw what you did. They didn't stop you. That makes them just as involved." Jake felt a weight on his chest. He had acted on a dare without thinking about the consequences, but now it seemed like everyone around him was being dragged into the mess. He glanced at Mark and the others and saw the worry in their faces. They probably didn't expect things to turn out this way either. The second officer stepped in. "We've seen incidents like this before. Sometimes tourists think that messing with guards is harmless fun. But what you don't realize is that these guards are trained professionals. They're not just standing there for pictures. They're responsible for the safety of the palace and everyone around it." Jake nodded, starting to understand the bigger picture. The guards weren't just part of a tradition. They were there to keep the place secure. What he had done might have seemed like a harmless joke, but to them, it could have been seen as a threat. His hands began to tremble as he thought about how close he had come to something much worse. The officers exchanged looks and then turned back to Jake. "We need to decide what to do next," the first officer said. "This is a serious situation, but we also understand that you didn't have bad intentions. However, your actions cannot go without consequences." Jake's stomach turned. He had no idea what those consequences might be. The thought of being thrown in jail or facing a huge fine terrified him. He was so far from home, and he had no idea how to fix what he had done. The officers seemed to talk among themselves for a moment, and Jake waited, trying to keep himself calm. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, the weight of his mistake sinking in deeper. He had ruined what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. It had started out with excitement and adventure, but now it was spiraling into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Finally, the officers turned back to Jake. "We're going to have to take you to the station for further questioning," the second officer said. "You'll need to explain your actions, and we'll figure out what steps to take from there." Jake's mind raced as the reality of the situation set in. He was about to be taken to a police station. He had no idea how long he'd be there, or what kind of trouble he could be in. His thoughts went to his family and friends back home, wondering how they would react when they found out. As they began to walk him toward the police car, Jake couldn't help but wish he could go back to that moment outside Buckingham Palace, when everything seemed so simple. If only he had made a different choice. But there was no turning back now. All he could do was hope for the best and face whatever came next. Jake was led to the police car, his mind spinning with confusion and regret. His heart was racing faster with every step, and he could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier. It felt like he was walking through a fog, as though none of this was really happening. He had thought his trip to London would be full of exciting experiences, not one mistake that could change everything. The officers guided him into the back seat, where they sat across from him in silence. The second officer, who had been more stern throughout the questioning, kept glancing at him with a look that suggested he still wasn't convinced of Jake's intentions. He could tell Jake was rattled, but it didn't seem to change the seriousness of the situation. As the car started to move, Jake's thoughts returned to the moment outside Buckingham Palace when he had made the decision to grab the guard's weapon. What had he been thinking? Was it worth it? His hands tightened into fists as he thought about the potential consequences, how this could turn into a full-blown international incident. He had no idea what kind of legal trouble he might be in. He thought about his family, his parents, who had trusted him to be responsible while he was traveling. What would they say when they found out? Would they be angry, disappointed, or both? His friends were still at the palace, probably still in shock from what had happened. Mark, who had dared him to do it, must be feeling guilty now. Jake could see it all in his mind. The awkward conversations they would have later, trying to explain the situation to people back home. He had never felt so far from the comfort of home. As the car drove on, the officer who had been speaking to him earlier turned to face Jake. "Listen, I know this wasn't your intention, but that doesn't change the fact that what you did could have had serious consequences," the officer said, his tone a bit softer now. "You're lucky no one got hurt, but this is something you'll have to live with for a long time." Jake nodded silently, his mind still racing. The officer's words sunk in, but they didn't offer him much comfort. The truth was, there was no easy way out of this. His prank had turned into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. They arrived at the police station, and Jake was escorted inside. The place felt cold and impersonal, the walls sterile and uninviting. He was led down a long hallway to a small room where they would continue their questioning. Sitting across from a desk, Jake was asked to sit down while one of the officers began typing on a computer. He could feel the tension in the air, and for a brief moment, he wondered if this was all just a bad dream he'd eventually wake up from. But there was no waking up. This was real. And Jake was now stuck in a situation that could have long-lasting consequences. After a few minutes, the officer stopped typing and looked up at Jake. "You're lucky we're not pressing charges immediately," he said. "But you'll need to stay in the country for a few more days while we finish processing the incident. We'll have to go over your case and you may be fined or face other penalties." Jake swallowed hard. The weight of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. A fine. Maybe even more serious consequences. He had never imagined his vacation would turn into something like this. He had taken the moment to have a little fun, but now he was facing a future filled with uncertainty. As the officer left the room to make a few more calls, Jake sat there, alone with his thoughts. He felt small, overwhelmed by the reality of the situation. He wished he could go back and undo everything, but it was too late. All he could do now was wait, hope for the best, and learn from his mistake. Jake sat alone in the small, cold room, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. His thoughts kept circling back to his friends, who were probably still at Buckingham Palace, confused and anxious about what had just happened. He could almost hear their voices in his head, asking why he had done something so reckless. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but now he was facing the consequences of his actions. The minutes dragged on slowly as Jake stared at the blank walls. He kept thinking about the moment he grabbed the Royal Guard's weapon, how everything had seemed so harmless at first. But now, in the sterile atmosphere of the police station, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a bad decision that he couldn't take back. He had made a fool of himself, and worse, he had put himself in serious trouble. He wondered how his parents would react when they found out. What would they say? He could already imagine their disappointment, their concern. He'd always prided himself on being responsible, on making smart choices. But now he had gone and made a huge mistake, one that might follow him for a long time. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. The door opened, and one of the officers stepped inside. "We've made our decision," he said, looking at Jake with a serious expression. Jake's stomach tightened. He had been dreading this moment. He didn't know if they were going to press charges or send him home with a fine. Either way, the consequences would likely be severe. "We're not going to arrest you, but you'll have to stay here for a few more days. The authorities need time to review the situation," the officer continued. "We'll be in touch about the fine, and you'll have to explain yourself to a judge before leaving the country." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The relief didn't last long, though. Staying in the country for several days, waiting for the legal process to play out, was the last thing he had expected when he boarded his plane to London. He had imagined sightseeing, enjoying the culture, and maybe sharing a few laughs with his friends. Instead, he was now stuck in a foreign country, facing the consequences of a prank gone wrong. The officer added, "This is a serious incident, and you should take it seriously. We're giving you a chance to make things right, but you need to understand the severity of the situation." Jake nodded silently. He knew they were right. He had underestimated the situation from the start, thinking that his prank wouldn't have any real consequences. Now, sitting in that cold room, he understood just how wrong he had been. The Royal Guard wasn't just a tourist attraction. He was a part of a carefully coordinated security system. And when Jake had grabbed that weapon, he had crossed a line. As the officer left the room, Jake was left alone again, his thoughts swirling with worry and regret. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could learn from it. He promised himself that, no matter what happened next, he would never take something so serious for granted again. He wondered how his friends were doing. They must have been worried sick, and he felt guilty for dragging them into this mess. He could only imagine what the news reports and social media posts must have said about the incident. He was now a part of a viral story, but it wasn't the kind of attention he had ever wanted. But at that moment, all Jake could do was wait. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, but he had no idea how long that process would take. It was a waiting game, and every minute felt like a lifetime. He just hoped that, eventually, the worst would be over, and he could go home and try to move on from this embarrassing chapter of his life. The next few days felt like an eternity for Jake. The initial shock of the incident had worn off, but now a constant wave of anxiety and uncertainty took its place. He was stuck in London, unable to enjoy any of the sights or experiences he had been so excited about. All his time was spent in the small, uncomfortable holding room at the police station or in his temporary accommodation, waiting for updates from the officers. Jake's friends had returned home to their hotel after the incident, but they were just as nervous and confused as he was. He kept in touch with them through text messages, but the uncertainty of what would happen next made it hard to feel comforted. They all tried to lighten the mood, but it was clear that the whole situation was weighing on everyone. Each day, Jake would check his phone, hoping for some news, but it was always the same. No updates, just the endless wait. The officers had been kind enough to explain that the process would take time, as they needed to review the footage of the incident and consult with higher authorities. Still, Jake couldn't help but feel frustrated. He had no idea what was going to happen next, and the days just seemed to drag on. Finally, after what felt like forever, Jake received a call from the police. His heart skipped a beat as he answered the phone, already bracing himself for whatever bad news was coming. "Hello, is this Jake?" the officer asked. "Yes, it's me," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've finished reviewing the situation," the officer said, his tone calm but serious. "And we've made our decision." Jake's stomach churned. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what came next. "You'll be fined for your actions, but we've decided not to press any further charges. However, you'll need to stay in the country for a few more days to clear up the paperwork. After that, you'll be free to go back home." A sense of relief washed over Jake, but it was quickly followed by a rush of guilt. A fine was bad enough, but at least he wasn't facing a criminal record. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions had caused unnecessary stress for everyone involved. He put himself, his friends, and even the officers in a difficult position over something as foolish as a prank. When Jake hung up the phone, he let out a long breath. The worst had passed, but there were still consequences to face. He couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He had come to London expecting a fun vacation, but now all he had was a lesson in responsibility. As he prepared to settle his fine, Jake found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about how his actions had affected not only the people around him, but also himself. A single decision, made in the heat of the moment, had changed the entire course of his trip. The feeling of having his actions scrutinized by authorities wasn't something he would soon forget. Jake couldn't go back and undo the mistake, but he could make sure it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He would never again take something as serious as a Royal Guard's weapon lightly. He had learned the hard way that some things weren't just part of the show. They were real, and they mattered. As the days passed, Jake began to feel the weight of the whole experience lift off his shoulders. The process wasn't over yet, but at least the worst part was behind him. He would never forget the lesson he had learned, and although his trip had been far from what he had imagined, he knew he would be a lot wiser the next time he traveled. After a long, tense wait, Jake was finally able to settle the fine and clear up the legal situation. He had been dreading this day, but now that it was over, he felt a mix of relief and lingering discomfort. His heart was no longer racing, and he no longer had to look over his shoulder every time someone in an official uniform walked by. But the experience had left an indelible mark on him. Jake's last few days in London were a stark contrast to the excitement he had felt when he first arrived. He had always imagined sightseeing and enjoying the city's rich history, but now he walked through the streets with a sense of caution, his mind still replaying everything that had happened. His friends, though supportive, had tried to make the best of the situation, but even they couldn't deny that the trip had taken a serious detour. He visited a few of the landmarks he had planned to see, but it was hard to shake off the memory of the police station, the tense hours spent waiting, and the weight of his mistake. It wasn't easy to put everything behind him, but slowly, Jake started to appreciate the fact that he was getting the chance to return home. His mind began to shift from regret to relief, though there was a part of him that couldn't fully forget what had happened. On the day of his departure, Jake packed his bags, ready to leave the city. The fine had been settled, and all he had to do now was catch his flight. As he stood in line at the airport, he felt a new sense of gratitude for the things he had taken for granted before. He had learned the importance of respect, responsibility, and the need to think carefully before acting. The weight of the whole situation had made him realize just how quickly things could spiral out of control. When Jake finally boarded his plane, there was a small sense of pride mixed with his relief. He had made it through, and he knew that this experience would stick with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't a souvenir he would want, but it was a lesson he couldn't afford to forget. As the plane took off, Jake looked out the window, watching the city below shrink smaller and smaller. He thought about how everything could have turned out much worse, how easily things could have escalated beyond a fine. He could have faced far more serious consequences, and he felt grateful that the situation hadn't gotten out of hand. The flight home gave him time to reflect on the lessons he had learned. What had started as a moment of foolishness had turned into a pivotal moment of growth. He would never again take something as serious as the Royal Guard's weapon for granted, and he would be more mindful of the impact his actions could have on others. When Jake finally arrived back home, he was greeted with a mix of relief and embarrassment. His family was glad to see him, but the story of what had happened in London had already spread, and there was no escaping the awkwardness that came with it. However, Jake didn't mind. He had learned to embrace his mistakes and had grown from them. The incident would always be a part of his story, but Jake had grown stronger because of it. He had learned the importance of thinking before acting, of considering the consequences, and of respecting the traditions and customs of the places he visited. It had been a hard lesson, but one that would shape the way he approached the world in the future. As time passed, the story became just another memory, something Jake could laugh about with his friends. He would never forget his trip to London, though it wasn't for the reasons he had originally imagined. In the end, Jake had learned that sometimes the most important lessons in life come from the most unexpected places.